Good day, everyone. Dawn of the Infinite is the new Mega Dungeon added to World of Warcraft in patch 10.1.5. It hosts a total of 8 bosses and can only be completed on Mythic difficulty. In today's video, I'll guide you through this bosses and their mechanics. I hope you'll find this information useful, so subscribe on my channel and let's begin. The first boss you'll find is Chronica. She will often cast a stomp, forming withering sand pools under players that inflict heavy arcane damage and reduce players' haste by 25 and movement speed by 15, so avoid standing in these. Chronica will target players and leap to their location one by one with Eon Chatter, inflicting massive damage to players in the targeted area and firing out Eon fragments, dealing damage to players struck and knocking them back. This leap will also spawn Eon residue inside the location that a player will have to soak. Otherwise, it will explode in a residue blast, dealing huge damage to all players and leaving a nasty dot on them. Tanks and healers will need to keep an eye out for Chronica knocking the tank away and causing a shared timeline, increasing the target's damage taken by 600% for 1 minute. This debuff cannot be dispelled until the massive healing absorbed from the lifespan shear is healed through, so be prepared to save healing cooldowns for this. Rinse and repeat until you take out the boss. Moving on to the second boss, we have the Manifested Time Warden. Around this boss are fields of decaying and accelerating time that continuously tick around the boss in segments. Decaying time inflicts arcane damage to players every 3 seconds and reduces players' damage taken by 20%. Accelerating time inflicts arcane damage every 1 second and increases movement speed by 30%. The boss will apply Chrono Faded to players that inflicts more arcane damage to players for 30 seconds and needs dispelling. Once dispelled, it will release a ripple of bronze magic dealing huge damage to players passing through it, so you'll need to run through it as quickly as possible. Fragments of time will emit pockets of time, which radiate outwards from the boss, inflicting damage upon impact and applying a dot for 6 seconds. This dot can stack, so avoid these at all costs. These pockets are also affected by decaying and accelerating time, so try and dodge them. Inside the decaying time pools, tanks will want to watch out for the Timeway's Unwind ability, inflicting arcane damage in a frontal cone twice if the tank is afflicted with decaying time. The second tick is noticeably delayed, so tanks will want to position themselves in the darker triangles for this ability. As well as a tank, you'll also want to make sure you are always in melee range of the boss. Otherwise, it will start to cast Radiant, inflicting arcane damage that increases by 15% for each cast. After defeating the Manifested Time Warden, the next boss you'll face is the Blight of Ofgalactron. This boss is a 3-stage encounter starting with an ooze that seeps toxic corruption on the ground through Blight Seep, draining the creature's energy. Occasionally, the Blight will afflict players with corrosion, causing a corrosive expulsion that deals damage to anyone within 3 yards of their impact and stunning them. Corrosion will inflict nature damage and reduce the afflicted target's haste by 5. This debuff stacks every 3 seconds until the player reaches 10 stacks and gets mind-controlled. To remove this debuff, you'll want to pass it to your tank, ready for Blight Reclamation. The Blight shoots out a frontal cone, inflicting big physical damage and pulling the tank in, also reclaiming the corrosion, removing the affliction from your tank. After taking enough damage, the Blight then transfers to a new host, Anzon, becomes active and has access to all of Blight's abilities, but will also cast Necrotic Winds, pulling players into the Blight Seep while sending out volleys of tornadoes. These tornadoes knock players back and inflict nature damage if struck, so be sure to avoid them. The final phase spawns Laws Calith and Dazak, which share a health pool via Essence connection. Again, they gain access to the previous abilities, but Laws will root a player with Necrofrost, reducing their haste by 20% until the ice is destroyed around them, so players will want to hard swap and burst this down. Dazak channels a frontal incinerating Blight Breath, so dodge this, but do note that it also damages the Necrofrost. He also casts Blight Spit, dealing damage to random players. Do you need help with Dawn of the Infinite completion? Check out conquestcapped.com. It's a trusted boosting service rated with 5 stars at Trustpilot. They can complete Dawn of the Infinite even without deaths for achievement and with up to 4 loot traders. Check out link in description. Next, we move on to the infamous Irdocron. The first thing to know with this fight is that defeating Irdocron is not the goal. Instead, we must break his home concentration so that our partner Chromie can attack. During the fight, Irdocron is trying to kill Chromie, so he must protect her as she protects us. The boss will target a player with Extinction Blast, one-shotting anyone within the impact zone unless you are under Chromie's timeline protection. This bubble reduces incoming damage to players by 97%, but will exhaust Chromie after the channel ends. To overcome her exhaustion, players must protect her from Stonecracker Barrage. This attack follows Extinction Blast and fires barrages of stone at Chromie for 2 seconds. This damage is split amongst Chromie and any players hit, so you'll all want to be inside the targeted zone. Tanks will need to position themselves in the front swirly to prevent the rest of the group and Chromie from being afflicted with Stonecrack, dealing big damage every 1 second for 15 seconds, and this effect stacks. Irdocron will shield himself with Earth Surge while the shield holds. He pulses out AoE damage to your group every 6 seconds, and these waves also increase the damage of the next wave by 25%. So, the aim of the game is to take out the shield as soon as possible while channeling. He will also be sending out erupting pillars that you'll need to dodge that also deal large damage and knock players back if struck. After destroying the shield, Irdocron will slam his wings down with pulverizing exhalation, dealing heavy nature damage to anybody caught in the huge frontal or circle under him. At this time, his wing slam also causes pulverizing creations to spawn under players. These creations will spam Car Stone Ball, inflicting a bleed on players, so stack them up, CC them, and burst them down. During the fight, the boss overwhelms the tank with Crushing Onslaught, increasing the physical damage taken by the player by 75% for 3 seconds, and this does stack. Tanks will need to be wary of this debuff getting too high. Finally, at 100% confidence, Irdocron unleashes a Cataclysmic Obliteration. He will concentrate on finishing his cast to unleash a one-shot to the party, but if players reduce his energy to 0 before the cast finishes through damage, his energy backfires and staggers him. To help with this, Chromie casts Timeline Transcendence, allowing players to see their future potential, increasing our damage, haste, cooldown recovery, and resource regeneration massively so that we can stop Irdocron. After defeating Irdocron, we will fly with Chromie to the next boss, and its Tyr, the Infinite Keeper. Tanks will have to deal with the boss's Titanic Blow, dealing huge physical damage in a frontal cone and leaving consecrated ground on the floor that deals fatal ticking damage. Tyr will also face random players and hit them with infinite annihilation, exactly the same as a tank frontal, but dealing less damage and again leaving some consecrated ground. The boss will also cast Dividing Strike, dealing huge arcane damage divided among players struck within a targeted area, and if less than 2 players are struck, the boss will gain Infinite Empowerment, increasing all his damage done by 33% for the rest of the fight, and this effect stacks. Tyr will inflict 2 players with Spark of Tear, dealing arcane damage every 2 seconds to players within 4 yards. Healers need to dispel this, but beware that upon removal, it would deal party-wide damage, so don't get too hasty with the dispels. Finally, at 0 energy, Tyr will siphon Ovastone, gaining a Radiant Barrier and causing a hastening eruption. While the Radiant Barrier holds, it inflicts AoE damage every 2 seconds, so players will need to burst down this shield as fast as possible. During the hastening eruption, volleys of Time Essence can be collected to increase haste and movement speed by 15%, stacking up to 3 times to help you delete the shield. However, time capsules that reach the Oathstone will add to Tyr's Radiant Barrier, so make sure to intercept these before they reach the middle. Now we move on to the alternate form of Chromie. Mochi the Chief is a boss with a frontal cone, so make sure to face her away from the group, and DPS spread out. Outside of this, she'll cast more problems, summoning clones of herself that channel a dragon's breath. Before her clones finish casting the spell, they will destabilize, leaving only the real Mochi to unleash a wide cone attack, so you'll need to find her quickly and position yourself behind her so you don't receive a Sand Buffet debuff. This applies a dot to players, dealing ticking damage every 1 second. Mochi is the only one not wearing a hat, so quickly scour the room and then hide behind her. Mochi also creates traps at random locations with time traps. Triggering these traps will cause a time stasis, rooting players for 30 seconds or trapping creatures until the next familiar face is cast. This cast summons copies of your party that fixate on the corresponding player, which you'll need to drag through a time trap. Otherwise, it'll probably kill you. Rinse and repeat this fight until you take her out. Next encounter is the Time Lost Battlefield. Here, the fight will change depending on your faction. This is a relatively simple fight with not too many mechanics. He will apply mortal wounds through Decapitate, reducing the tank's healing received. Another Grumash ability is Shockwave, unleashing multiple strikes in a frontal cone at the tank. Grumash will cast Bladestorm on a random player. Dodge this whenever he is channeling. He will also deal AoE damage to your group through Warcry dealing nature damage. Similarly to Anduin, he will summon 3 adds through for the Horde ability, cleave these down fast, and dispel the Immolate Dote that the Warlocks apply. And finally, every time Grumash loses 10% health, he will gain a stacking damage buff through Rage. That's all for this encounter. The last boss in Dawn of the Infinite is Chrono Lord Dios. This is a 2-phase encounter where the main aim is to take out the adds as soon as possible in Phase 1. These infinite timekeepers will create portals that summon reinforcements that we must take out. Upon defeating these timekeepers, the rift destabilizes, inflicting 15% max health to Dios over 4 seconds. Take out these timekeepers as quickly as you can so that you're not overwhelmed when more spawns. At the same time, you'll be dealing with Dios, who will conjure infinity orbs, which fall to the ground, and upon arrival will explode in an infinity nova, dealing huge damage to players, and increasing their damage taken from future novas by 300% for 3 seconds, and this stacks. Do note that these orbs will fall slower when players are stood underneath them, so if you do need to stagger the debuff, then just assign players to stand underneath them. Dios will cast a frontal breath on tanks inflicting arcane damage, and slowing their haste and movement speed by 20%. This effect does stack, but also affects enemy units, so tanks should try and aim these at the summoned adds too. Upon defeating all of the timekeepers, the boss will now enter stage 2 at 20% health. Dios has 3 abilities that he will repeatedly cast until the end of the fight. Infinite Corruption is the new one that blasts Nostormu with bronze magic, sending arcane artillery throughout the arena, so make sure to dodge these swirlies. These will scar the ground for 2 minutes, dealing nature damage to the players standing within it. Try not to fill up the room. He summons even more infinity orbs that you can stagger by standing underneath them to better deal with the Infinity Nova debuff. And finally, Dios continues to cast his Temporal Breath frontal attack. And during this phase, Nordstromu is freed, and we also receive a haste buff, so this stage of the fight is actually pretty easy. That's all you need to know for the bosses inside the Dawn of the Infinite Megadungeon. Stay safe and good luck.